The listing was almost too good to be true. A sprawling Victorian house on the outskirts of a small town, complete with antique furnishings, modern amenities, and a price tag that screamed, steal. Erica couldn't believe her luck. She was looking for a quiet retreat to finish her novel, and this Airbnb seemed perfect. She arrived just before dusk. The house loomed over her, its once pristine white paint weathered and peeling. The front porch creaked as she stepped onto it, but Erica convinced herself it was just old charm. The lockbox code worked seamlessly, and the door groaned open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and something faintly metallic. The listing photos hadn't lied. Ornate chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and intricate woodwork framed every door and window. The host had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome, Erica. I hope you enjoy your stay. Let me know if you need anything. P.S. The attic is off limits. Thanks." The first night was uneventful. Erica settled in, unpacked, and began writing. The silence of the house was unnerving at first, but she attributed it to being in an unfamiliar place. She brushed off the occasional creak or groan of the house, chalking it up to its age. It was the second night when things took a strange turn. She was in bed, her laptop casting a dim glow in the dark room, when she heard the faintest sound of footsteps overhead. Erica froze. The attic. Her host had specifically mentioned it was off limits. Maybe an animal had gotten in? She tried to ignore it, but the steps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and messaged the host. "Hi, I think there might be something in the attic. Could it be a raccoon or something?" The reply came almost immediately. "Please don't go up there. It's not safe." The response left Erica unsettled. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she heard faint whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind through the cracks in the old house, but the more she listened, the more distinct they became, soft voices, murmuring unintelligibly. By the third day, she was questioning her sanity. She hadn't gotten much writing done, and her exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. The footsteps in the attic continued sporadically, accompanied now by faint tapping on the walls. Erica's messages to the host went unanswered. She considered leaving, but the nearest motel was an hour away, and she didn't relish the thought of driving through the isolated countryside at night. That evening, as she sat in the living room trying to distract herself with a movie, she heard a loud thud upstairs. It was followed by a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Her stomach dropped. Grabbing a flashlight, she made her way upstairs. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but the sight of her bedroom door ajar wasn't it. She was certain she had closed it. Swallowing her fear, she pushed it open. The room was exactly as she'd left it, except for one thing, a small wooden box sitting on the center of the bed. She approached it cautiously. The box was old, its surface covered in strange carvings that looked almost like runes. She opened it slowly, revealing a collection of old yellowed photographs. The images were chilling. People standing in various parts of the house, their faces blurred or distorted. Some of the figures appeared to have empty sockets where their eyes should have been. One photo caught her attention. A young woman standing in the attic, her face obscured, but her posture unmistakably terrified. Behind her, a shadowy figure loomed, its elongated limbs stretching toward her. Erica's breath hitched. She slammed the box shut and shoved it under the bed. Her hands were trembling as she grabbed her phone to call the host. The line went straight to voicemail. She decided she couldn't stay another night. She began packing her things in a frenzy, her mind racing. As she shoved clothes into her suitcase, the lights in the house flickered. Then, the power went out entirely. The house was plunged into darkness. Erica fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, the beam casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the hallway. Her heart felt like it would explode. She swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the hallway was empty. The growl came again, this time from behind her. She spun around, and for a brief moment she saw it, the figure from the photograph. Its gaunt face was pale and featureless, its mouth an unnatural gash that stretched impossibly wide. Erica screamed and bolted down the stairs, leaving her belongings behind. As she reached the front door, it slammed shut in her face. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were all around her now, growing louder, almost deafening. She turned and saw the figure at the top of the stairs, slowly descending toward her. In a desperate bid, she ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. She faced the figure, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the weapon. "Stay back!" she shouted, though her voice cracked with fear. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if curious. Then it vanished. The whispers stopped. The house was silent again, but Erica didn't dare move. She stood there for what felt like hours, her back pressed against the counter, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. When dawn finally broke, the front door creaked open on its own. Erica didn't question it. She ran to her car, leaving everything behind, outside, and didn't stop driving until she reached the safety of a crowded gas station. Later, when she tried to contact Airbnb to report the incident, she was told the listing didn't exist. There was no record of her booking, no messages from the host. Even the payment she'd made had disappeared from her account history. Erica never wrote about her experience. Every time she tried, her mind would go blank and her hands would shake uncontrollably. But she couldn't forget the last thing she saw as she sped away from the house, its attic window, where the shadowy figure watched her leave, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The Airbnb listing was unusual, to say the least. It described the property as a quiet, rustic retreat surrounded by dense forest. But what caught Mia's attention was the tagline: "Unplug and experience true isolation." It sounded perfect for her, a workaholic in desperate need of a digital detox. The photos showed a cozy, single-story cabin with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch. There were no neighbors, no Wi-Fi, and no cell signal. When she arrived, the isolation was palpable. The dirt road to the cabin was barely wide enough for her car, with trees pressing in on both sides. The cabin itself was smaller than it had seemed in the photos, but it exuded charm. The host had left a handwritten note on the counter. "Welcome, Mia. I hope you enjoy your stay. Please remember, the woods can be disorienting, so don't wander too far, and please bring the lantern inside before dark." Mia noticed the lantern sitting on the porch, a bulky, antique thing with a dim, yellow glow. She thought it was a quirky touch and set it on the kitchen counter. After unpacking, she explored the property. The trees formed an almost impenetrable wall around the cabin, but there was a narrow path leading into the woods. She followed it for a short distance, but the thick canopy overhead made it dark, even in daylight. The air was cooler in the forest, and every sound, her footsteps, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. She turned back quickly. The first night was uneventful, though unnervingly quiet. Mia had grown accustomed to the hum of the city, and the lack of background noise made her uneasy. She left the lantern on the counter and went to bed, hoping the stillness would lull her to sleep. She woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft scratching. At first, she thought it was an animal outside, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was coming from the front door. She froze, her heart pounding. She wasn't expecting visitors, and the cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, Mia thought she'd imagined it. Then came the knock. 3 slow, heavy thuds. She sat up, gripping the blanket tightly. The knock came again, louder this time. She tiptoed to the window, careful not to make a sound. Peeking through the curtain, she saw nothing. The porch was empty. The lantern was still on the counter where she'd left it, its faint glow casting long shadows on the walls. The knocks stopped, and the cabin fell silent again. Mia didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, she stepped onto the porch to investigate. The wood was damp from dew, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. She tried to shake off her unease and spent the day reading and sketching to distract herself. As dusk fell, she noticed the lantern on the counter had started to dim. The glow, once steady, now flickered like a dying candle. She picked it up, planning to take it outside as the host had suggested, but a strange resistance stopped her. It felt heavy, unnaturally so, as if it didn't want to be moved. She set it back down and decided to ignore it. That night, the noises returned, soft scratching, the same deliberate knocks. This time, they were louder, more insistent. Mia tried to convince herself it was the wind, but when she checked the weather earlier, there had been no sign of a storm. The knocking moved, first to the windows, then to the back door. Her chest tightened as she realized whatever, or whoever, it was circling the cabin. She huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching a fireplace poker for protection. The lantern's flickering glow was the only source of light. Around 3 a.m., the knocking stopped. But the quiet didn't bring comfort. Instead, it felt oppressive, like the air was thicker, heavier. And then she heard it, a low whisper, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the lantern. She leaned closer, her breath shallow, and caught a fragment of a word. Stay. Mia's blood ran cold. She shoved the lantern into the closet and slammed the door, her hands trembling. The whispers stopped, but a new sound emerged. A deep, guttural growl. It didn't come from the closet, though. It was outside. The porch creaked as something heavy stepped onto it. Mia didn't dare move. The footsteps grew closer until they stopped right outside the window. She could feel a presence there, watching her, but she couldn't bring herself to look. Suddenly, the lantern, still in the closet, burst into a brilliant yellow light, its glow seeping through the cracks in the door. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping, a cacophony of voices pleading, shouting, crying. The growling outside intensified, and the cabin began to shake as if something massive was pressing against it. Mia couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her car keys and bolted out the back door. The forest was pitch black, but she didn't care. She sprinted down the dirt road, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The lantern was on the porch, its glow visible even from a distance. And standing next to it was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated arms that almost touched the ground. Its face was featureless, except for 2 hollow eyes that glowed the same eerie yellow as the lantern. Mia never returned for her belongings. The Airbnb listing was gone when she tried to find it again. The host didn't reply to her messages, and her account history showed no record of the booking. But sometimes late at night, she swears she hears the faint sound of knocking and the whisper of a single word, stay. It was supposed to be a dream vacation for Tom and Rachel, a week in a secluded lakefront Airbnb to celebrate their anniversary. The photos had promised crystal clear waters, a charming A-frame cabin, and total privacy. The host had even messaged them directly to assure their stay would be uninterrupted bliss. They arrived on a crisp autumn evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lake in hues of orange and red. The cabin was cozy and well kept, with a faint scent of cedar lingering in the air. Rachel marveled at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of the lake, now shrouded in twilight. A guest book sat on the coffee table, filled with glowing reviews of the property. The first entry caught Rachel's eye. Best stay ever, but don't answer the door after dark. She frowned and flipped through more entries. Some repeated the odd warning, always with a playful tone. Tom laughed it off, saying it was probably an inside joke from the previous guests. They settled in for the night, enjoying a bottle of wine by the fireplace. As the evening wore on, the sense of peace was palpable. No city noise, no distractions, just the 2 of them and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Around midnight, a knock echoed through the cabin. Tom froze mid-sip. Did you hear that? Rachel nodded, her brow furrowing. Maybe it's the host? Or a neighbor? Out here? Tom shook his head. I thought this place was supposed to be secluded. The knock came again, louder this time. Rachel rose cautiously and approached the door, but Tom grabbed her arm. Wait. Remember the guest book? Rachel rolled her eyes. You think a joke in the guest book means we shouldn't open the door? Tom didn't respond. Instead, he peered through the peephole. His shoulders stiffened, and he backed away. What is it? Rachel whispered. There's no one there. The knock came again, impossibly loud, rattling the door on its hinges. Rachel's heart raced as Tom locked the deadbolt. This isn't funny, he said, raising his voice. Whoever you are, leave. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then came a new sound, scratching, slow and deliberate, moving along the walls of the cabin. It started near the front door, then traveled toward the large windows facing the lake. Rachel turned off the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness. Maybe it's an animal, she whispered, clutching Tom's arm. An animal that knocks? He muttered. They sat in silence, the scratching growing fainter until it disappeared entirely. Relieved, Rachel exhaled and tried to laugh it off. Probably just some prankster. Let's go to bed. Tom reluctantly agreed. They left the lights off as they climbed into bed, hoping sleep would bring some sense of normalcy. But neither of them truly relaxed. Every creak of the cabin sent their nerves on edge. At some point during the night, Rachel awoke to a strange noise. It was faint, almost like a voice, but muffled, as if it were underwater. She nudged Tom awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes, but as the sound grew louder, he sat up abruptly. The voice was clearer now, soft, melodic, calling from the direction of the lake. "Is someone out there?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Tom pulled aside the curtain just enough to peek out. "I don't see anything," he whispered. But Rachel wasn't looking at the lake. She was staring at the sliding glass door at the back of the cabin. Her breath caught in her throat. "Tom," he turned and saw it. A figure standing just outside the glass. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its hands, spindly and pale, were pressed against the glass, leaving greasy smears. Tom grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and hurled it toward the figure. The glass didn't shatter, but the impact sent the figure retreating into the darkness. "We're leaving," Tom said, his voice shaking. He grabbed the car keys in Rachel's hand, and they bolted for the front door. The cabin was eerily silent as they ran to the car. Tom started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. As they sped down the dirt road, Rachel glanced back at the cabin. The figure was standing on the porch now, illuminated by the car's red taillights. It didn't chase them. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, watching. They didn't stop driving until they reached a nearby town. The motel receptionist looked at them strangely when they arrived, disheveled and wide-eyed, but she didn't ask questions. The next morning, Tom tried to contact the Airbnb host to report what had happened. The listing was gone. Their messages to the host bounced back as undeliverable. Even their payment had vanished from their credit card statement, as if they had never booked the cabin at all. A week later, Rachel checked her phone while scrolling through social media. A post from a local news outlet caught her attention. It showed a photo of a dilapidated A-frame cabin by a lake. The headline read, "Body found in abandoned lakefront property vacant for over a decade." Her blood ran cold as she read the article. The cabin had been unoccupied for years, and the body found inside was identified as the property's owner. According to the report, the man had died under mysterious circumstances, his body showing signs of starvation, though the fridge had been fully stocked. The last line of the article sent a shiver down her spine. Authorities report strange markings on the windows and doors of the property, resembling handprints. Rachel showed Tom the article. They sat in silence, unable to shake the feeling that they had escaped something far worse than they could ever understand. The Airbnb listing had been oddly sparse, just a few photos of a quaint farmhouse surrounded by fields and forest. The description was simple: escape the noise, enjoy peace and quiet in this historic country retreat. There were no reviews, but the price was low, and Alex was desperate for a getaway. A week alone to work on his photography sounded perfect. The drive was longer than expected, taking Alex deep into the countryside. The road narrowed as fields gave way to dense woods. His GPS announced he'd arrived, though he saw no mailbox or driveway, just a narrow dirt path winding through the trees. Hesitant, Alex followed it. The farmhouse appeared suddenly, its silhouette looming against the darkening sky. It was much older than the photos had shown. The white paint was peeling and the shutters hung crooked. The surrounding fields were overgrown, the grass swaying in the windless evening. Alex parked and stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots breaking the eerie silence. The house seemed abandoned. The porch sagged, and the windows were so dusty they reflected the fading sunlight like mirrors. The key was in the lockbox as promised. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper. A single handwritten note sat on the kitchen counter. "Welcome, Alex. Make yourself at home. Please keep the doors locked at night. Enjoy your stay." It struck him as odd but not alarming. He chalked it up to rural caution and went about unpacking. The sun dipped below the horizon as he explored the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. A creak overhead startled him, but he reasoned it was just the old house settling. That night, Alex sat in the living room, editing photos. The old farmhouse groaned around him, its noises strange but not unexpected. He was so engrossed in his work that it took him a moment to notice the faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. Alex froze. He stared at the staircase, the darkness at the top swallowing the faint light from his laptop. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, a bird on the roof, an old pipe. But the sound continued, growing louder. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. No response. Slowly he climbed the stairs. The tapping stopped as he reached the top. There were 3 doors in the hallway, each slightly ajar. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing dusty furniture and empty rooms. Nothing. Feeling foolish, Alex went back downstairs and locked the doors, double-checking every window latch. He told himself it was just the house's age playing tricks on him. But as he settled back into the couch, the tapping resumed. This time it was coming from the front door. Alex's stomach twisted. He stood frozen, staring at the door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. He forced himself to move, creeping toward the door and peeking through the peephole. No one was there. A shiver ran down his spine as he stepped back. The tapping stopped, but then he heard it again, on the window. Alex spun around, the flashlight in his hand trembling. The beam landed on the window, illuminating nothing but his reflection. The tapping was louder now, almost like a knock, echoing from every window at once. Panicked, Alex turned off the flashlight and ducked behind the couch, his heart pounding. The noises ceased abruptly, plunging the house into an oppressive silence. He sat in the dark for hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The morning brought a false sense of relief. Sunlight filtered through the windows, and the house felt less oppressive. Determined to salvage his trip, Alex grabbed his camera and ventured outside. The fields were eerily still, the tall grass brushing against him as he walked. He stopped when he reached the edge of the forest. Something glinted in the dirt, a small, rusted object. He crouched down and picked it up, realizing it was an old key. Nearby, a stone marker jutted from the ground, overgrown with moss. He wiped it clean, revealing faded carvings. Elias Carter, 1879 to 1901. A grave. He stepped back, unnerved, and turned to head back to the house. But as he moved, he felt the air grow heavy, the sunlight dimming as if clouds had rolled in. The trees seemed closer now, their branches reaching toward him. That night, the noises returned, louder, closer. Alex barricaded himself in the bedroom, but the tapping followed him. It was no longer just at the windows. It was on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He clutched his phone, desperately trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The tapping grew into pounding, shaking the walls of the house, and then it stopped. The silence was deafening. Alex waited, holding his breath. He dared to peek out the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Figures stood in the overgrown fields, dozens of them, their outlines barely visible in the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but they were watching. Alex didn't sleep. At dawn, he packed his things and fled, leaving the farmhouse behind. He didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town. When he tried to contact the host to report the experience, the listing was gone. No record of his booking existed. Weeks later, Alex found the key he'd picked up by the grave tucked into his camera bag. He didn't remember putting it there. He threw it into the trash and tried to forget. But every night, he hears it again, the tapping, first at the windows, then on the walls. And when he dares to look outside, he sees them, watching, waiting. It was late October when Lily booked the Airbnb, a picturesque Victorian house nestled in the heart of a small, quiet town. She needed time away from the city's chaos, a weekend, to focus on her writing. The house, with its stained glass windows and intricate woodwork, felt like the perfect inspiration. The host had been welcoming, but oddly specific in their instructions. Enjoy your stay, but please don't open the attic door. It's locked for a reason. Lily dismissed it as precautionary, maybe a safety concern. She had no intention of poking around. The rest of the house was charming. Antique furniture, creaky wooden floors, and a fireplace that crackled with warmth. Her first evening was productive. The quiet was soothing, and words poured onto her laptop as rain began to patter against the windows. Around midnight, as she prepared for bed, she heard it, a faint sound from above, almost like footsteps. She froze, listening intently. The house was old, she reasoned. Wood expanded and shifted, especially in the rain. She shook off her unease and went to bed. convincing herself it was nothing. The next morning was uneventful, but as the day wore on, her discomfort grew. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The ornate mirrors in the hallway seemed to hold shadows that didn't belong, and every now and then she thought she heard whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that vanished when she stopped to listen. By the second night, her nerves were frayed. The footsteps from the attic returned, louder this time. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just above her. She grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, despite the host's warning. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, its keyhole dark and uninviting. She pressed her ear to the wood, holding her breath. The pacing stopped. "Hello?" she whispered. No response. Heart pounding, she shook the door handle. It was locked, just as the host had said. Relieved, she turned to leave. But as she walked away, she heard it again. Footsteps. Only now they were on the stairs leading down from the attic. Lily didn't sleep that night. She stayed in the living room with all the lights on, clutching her phone in case she needed to call for help. The sounds continued. Soft creaks, faint whispers, the occasional thud. When morning finally came, she decided she'd had enough. She packed her things and prepared to leave. As she reached for the front door, she noticed something she hadn't before. Scratch marks on the wood, faint but unmistakable. They trailed from the doorframe toward the hallway, leading to the attic stairs. Her blood ran cold. She bolted to her car and drove away, her tires skidding on the wet pavement. She didn't stop until she was miles from the house. Curious and still shaken, Lily later looked up the property online. She found an old news article. Victorian house sold after tragedy. The article detailed a grisly story. Decades ago, a reclusive man had lived there, locking himself in the attic for years. When he stopped responding to visitors, police found his body inside. But the chilling detail came at the end of the article. Locals claim the man was not alone. They say he often spoke of someone else in the attic with him, a presence he couldn't escape. Lily never returned to the Airbnb. She blocked the host's number, deleted her account, and avoided anything resembling Victorian houses. But some nights, when the rain taps against her window, she swears she hears the faint creak of footsteps overhead. The Airbnb had been a last-minute find. Caleb was attending a work conference in a small mountain town and needed an affordable place to stay. The listing was titled "Cozy Cottage in the Woods" and showed a modest cabin surrounded by dense forest. It seemed quaint and quiet, perfect for a few nights of solitude. The host had messaged shortly after Caleb booked. "Welcome! The cabin is stocked with essentials. Cell service can be spotty, but there's a landline if you need anything. One thing to note, if you hear tapping at the windows, don't look." Caleb chuckled at the odd warning, assuming it was some local superstition meant to spook tourists. He brushed it off and made the drive up winding mountain roads, arriving just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cabin was smaller than expected, but cozy. The interior was rustic, with handmade quilts, wooden beams, and an old stone fireplace. True to the host's warning, his phone had no signal, but the landline on the kitchen wall worked fine. After unpacking, Caleb settled in for the night, enjoying the silence of the forest. It was around midnight when the first tap came. A single deliberate sound against the window by the front door. Caleb glanced up from his laptop, startled. He waited, listening. Tap, tap, tap. His stomach tightened. He reminded himself it was likely just a branch in the wind. The cabin was surrounded by trees, after all. But when he went to the window, he saw nothing. No trees close enough to touch the glass, and no sign of movement outside. Just darkness and the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. The tapping stopped, and Caleb forced himself to laugh. "Creepy cabin vibes," he muttered, returning to his seat. An hour later, it started again. This time, it was on the window in the bedroom. Tap, tap, tap. He froze. The bedroom window was on the second floor. There was no deck or ladder outside, just a sheer drop to the ground below. His heart pounded as the sound continued, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. He grabbed his phone, instinctively trying to call someone, anyone, but there was no service. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. He remembered the host's warning. If you hear tapping, don't look. Caleb's curiosity burned, but fear rooted him in place. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, willing the sound to stop. After a few agonizing minutes, it did. The silence was suffocating. Exhausted and on edge, Caleb eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the cabin seemed almost peaceful again. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and birds chirped in the trees. Caleb tried to shake off the unease of the night before. He spent the day exploring the nearby trails, photographing the vibrant autumn foliage. When he returned to the cabin that evening, he found something that made his blood run cold. Scratches. Deep, jagged grooves marred the outside of the bedroom window frame. The marks were too high for any animal to have made them, and they formed a pattern, long, parallel lines like fingers clawing at the wood. Caleb locked every door and window before nightfall. He sat in the living room, too tense to sleep, staring into the fireplace as the shadows lengthened around him. The tapping started again around midnight. This time it was on the living room window, directly behind him. Tap, tap, tap. Caleb clenched his fists, every muscle in his body screaming to look, but he stayed frozen. The tapping moved, first to the kitchen window, then the window by the staircase, growing faster, more erratic. Tap, 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 tap. It was everywhere now, surrounding the cabin, hammering against the glass like a swarm of invisible hands. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on him like a weight. Caleb didn't dare move, barely dared to breathe. He stared at the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. And then he saw it. A figure, reflected in the glass of the framed photograph on the mantel. It stood just behind him, tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and a face shrouded in darkness. Its hand was raised, a single bony finger poised to tap. Caleb bolted for the door, not bothering to grab his things. He sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at his skin, as he stumbled down the dirt path toward his car. He didn't stop running until he reached the vehicle, fumbling with the keys before finally starting the engine. As he sped down the mountain road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but he saw movement, a figure standing in the doorway, watching him leave. When Caleb contacted Airbnb to report the incident, the representative was confused. The listing didn't exist. There was no record of his reservation, no host by the name he'd messaged. Even the address led nowhere. For weeks after, Caleb couldn't sleep. Every creak of his apartment, every gust of wind against the windows sent him into a panic. He stopped looking at mirrors, reflections, anything that might show him what was behind him. But no matter how hard he tried to forget, the sound haunted him. Tap, tap, tap. The Airbnb listing had been simple. A cozy apartment in an old brownstone, tucked away in the heart of a historic city district. The photos showed warm lighting, vintage furniture, and high ceilings. Mia was immediately drawn to its charm. She needed a quiet place to stay while attending a week-long art workshop, and the location was perfect. The host's message was polite but brief. "Welcome, Mia. I hope you enjoy your stay. Please don't mind the second bedroom. It's locked for storage." Mia shrugged it off. Many short-term rentals had similar arrangements. She arrived late in the evening, her suitcase rattling against cobblestones as she found the building. The apartment was just as lovely as the photos. Soft rugs, a faint smell of lavender, and an old record player spinning a jazz tune that the host must have left running. Exhausted from travel, Mia unpacked quickly and settled into the bedroom. The apartment was quiet, almost eerily so, but she was grateful for the peace. The first night was uneventful. She woke up refreshed and ready to head to her workshop. The day passed quickly, and by the time she returned, it was dark. She noticed something odd as she unlocked the door. The faintest smell of smoke, like a blown-out candle. Inside, everything looked untouched. She assumed one of the neighbors might have been smoking nearby. Shrugging it off, she turned on the lights and began sketching at the small desk in the living room. That's when she heard it. A soft, muffled sound, almost like footsteps coming from the locked second bedroom. Mia froze, her pencil suspended in midair. She listened closely. The noise stopped. She told herself it was the building settling. Old homes had their quirks, after all. Shaking off the unease, she turned on some music and went back to her sketches. But that night, the noises continued. As she lay in bed, she could hear faint thuds, shuffling movements, and what sounded like a soft hum. It came from behind the locked door. She texted the host the next morning, "Hi, I think I might have heard something in the second bedroom last night. Could someone have access to it?" The reply came quickly. "No one has access. Don't worry. It's just an old house. Probably the pipes or creaky wood. Let me know if you need anything else." Mia wasn't convinced, but she tried to let it go. The workshop kept her busy. and by the time she returned to the apartment each evening, she was too tired to dwell on it. On the third night, the sounds grew louder. The humming was clearer now, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was trying to sing under their breath. Mia sat up in bed, clutching her phone. She stared at the locked door, half expecting it to swing open. Gathering her courage, she approached it. She pressed her ear against the wood. The humming stopped. Her heart pounded as she whispered, "Hello?" There was no response. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently, as if someone was trying to open it from the other side. Mia screamed, stumbling back. The rattling stopped just as abruptly as it had started. She didn't sleep that night. Sitting on the couch with all the lights on, her phone clutched in her hand. When morning came, she called the host. "Is there any chance someone could be in there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The host paused before replying. "That door hasn't been opened in years. It's locked for a reason. Please don't try to open it." Mia demanded an explanation, but the host simply apologized and hung up. Furious and frightened, she decided to leave. She packed her things and booked a hotel for the rest of her stay. As she made one last pass through the apartment to ensure she hadn't left anything, she heard a faint whisper coming from the locked room. She froze, her suitcase handle slipping from her grasp. Mia, her name soft and drawn out like a sigh. Her blood ran cold. Without a second glance, she grabbed her bag and bolted out the door. She didn't stop running until she was far from the apartment. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of her. She searched for the listing online, but it was gone. Digging deeper, she found an old news article about the building. Decades ago, a tenant in the second-floor apartment had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises from her unit for weeks before she vanished, but no one ever saw her leave. The article included a photo of the woman. Mia's heart sank as she stared at the image. The tenant looked eerily familiar, almost like an older version of herself. To this day, Mia can't explain what happened in that apartment, but every so often when she's alone at night, she swears she hears it again, the faint hum of a tune she'll never forget.